The city's pulse was a rhythm Alistair Finch had long since mastered. It was a symphony of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and the urgent, clipped tones of multi-million-dollar deals being closed. He moved through this world not as a man, but as a force of nature, a titan of industry whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms across the globe. His days were a meticulously curated sequence of events, scheduled down to the second, each moment an investment, each interaction a transaction. His penthouse apartment, a sterile expanse of glass and steel perched high above the sprawling metropolis, reflected the man he had become: isolated, immaculate, and untouchable. From this vantage point, the city below was a silent, glittering tapestry, its inhabitants merely abstract concepts, cogs in the vast machine of commerce he so expertly manipulated. He hadn't walked its streets in years, not in any meaningful way. His driver, a silent man named Arthur, ferried him from one climate-controlled environment to another, the tinted windows of his Maybach a permanent filter between his world and the real one. But today, something was different. A sudden, uncharacteristic whim, a fleeting memory of a time when the city was a place of discovery rather than a conquest, had taken root. He had dismissed Arthur for the afternoon, deciding to walk the 10 blocks to his next meeting. It was a foolish decision, impractical and inefficient, and the novelty of it wore off almost immediately. The city at ground level was a chaotic assault on the senses. The cacophony of sirens, the press of the crowd, the cloying smell of street food and exhaust fumes, it was all so unfiltered. He clutched his briefcase, a shield against the grime and the unpredictability of it all. He was just about to pass a small, unassuming food cart, the kind he would never deign to notice when he saw it. A simple, artisanal pastry, a man, displayed under a small glass dome. It was a ghost from another life, a memory of a trip to Brittany with his mother. Long before the empire, long before the isolation, it was a stupid, sentimental impulse, but he found himself reaching for his wallet, the unfamiliar feel of cash in his hands. He paid the vendor, a woman with tired eyes who didn't recognize the financial deity standing before her, and turned to take a bite, a small, ridiculous rebellion against the man he was supposed to be. He was bringing the pastry to his lips, a flicker of something almost like warmth stirring in his chest, when a voice, sharp and frantic, cut through the urban din. "Don't eat that!" It was a boy no older than 12, his face smudged with dirt, his clothes ragged, his eyes wide with a desperate, unnerving certainty. Alistair froze, his hand hovering inches from his mouth, the pastry a symbol of a life he'd left behind, now held in stasis by the cry of a child who had nothing. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. Him, Alistair Finch, taking orders from a street urchin. He was about to dismiss the boy with a contemptuous wave, to silence him with a crisp bill he didn't deserve. But something in the boy's eyes held him captive. It wasn't the look of a common beggar, not the practiced desperation he'd seen 1,000 times. This was different. This was raw, unadulterated terror, and it was directed at him. Alistair's initial reaction was a surge of pure, unadulterated annoyance. The carefully constructed bubble of his world had been pierced by the most unlikely of sources, and the intrusion was as unwelcome as it was baffling. He was a man who commanded obedience through his very presence, whose quietest suggestion could send ripples through the stock market. Yet here he was, frozen on a grimy sidewalk, his hands suspended in mid-air, all because a homeless child had yelled at him. The people hurrying past on the crowded pavement threw them fleeting, incurious glances, just another one of the city's strange, momentary dramas. For a brief, infuriating moment, Alistair saw himself through their eyes, not a titan of industry, but a well-dressed man being accosted by a street kid. The thought was galling. He lowered his hand slowly, the pastry still clutched within his grasp, his knuckles white. He fixed the boy with a glare that had made grown men tremble, a look that could dissect a man's weaknesses and lay them bare on a boardroom table. "And why shouldn't I eat this?" he asked, his voice low and cold, each word a carefully polished stone of condescension. He expected the boy to flinch, to stammer an apology, perhaps to launch into a fabricated story designed to elicit pity and a handout. He was prepared for the usual script, the one he'd learned to recognize and dismiss with brutal efficiency. But the boy didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his small frame trembling slightly, but his gaze unwavering. Because you can't," the boy stammered, taking a hesitant step closer. It's not safe." Alistair almost laughed. Not safe. It was a pastry, a confection of butter and sugar from a licensed street vendor. What could possibly be unsafe about it? Was the boy insane? Was this some elaborate new form of street theater designed to part fools from their money? Not safe, Alistair repeated, his tone laced with a sarcasm so sharp it could have cut glass. "I assure you, I can afford to risk a little indigestion. Now, if you'll excuse me." He made a move to turn away, to dismiss the boy and the entire ridiculous episode from his mind. But the boy lunged forward, not to grab at him, but to point a trembling finger at the pastry in his hand. "No, please, you have to believe me. Look at it. Just look at it." Against his better judgment, Alistair glanced down at the pastry. It looked exactly as it had a moment ago, golden brown, caramelized, inviting. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to warrant this level of hysteria. He was about to tell the boy to get lost, to threaten to call the police, when he noticed it. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail. Near the base of the pastry, nestled in one of the flaky golden folds, was a small, dark speck. It was no bigger than a penhead, and at first he thought it was just a bit of burnt sugar, a common imperfection. But the boy's frantic insistence had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny, insidious weed in the manicured garden of his certainty. He squinted, bringing the pastry closer to his eyes. The dark speck wasn't burnt sugar. It had a strange, almost metallic glint. It was a shard of something. Glass? Metal? He couldn't be sure. But it was undeniably foreign, something that had no business being in a piece of food. A cold dread, an unfamiliar and deeply unsettling sensation, began to creep up his spine. The boy was watching him, his eyes wide, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. He saw the flicker of recognition in Alistair's face, the dawning horror that was slowly replacing the arrogant dismissal. "You see?" the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "You see it, don't you?" Alistair's world, a world built on logic, on calculated risks and predictable outcomes, tilted on its axis. The shard in the pastry was a tiny, jagged anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of his carefully ordered reality. His mind, accustomed to processing complex financial data and intricate legal documents, struggled to reconcile the image in his hand with the situation he was in. The boy, this nameless, faceless child of the streets, had just saved him. The thought was so preposterous, so utterly outside the realm of his experience, that it left him momentarily breathless. He could have swallowed that shard. The potential consequences, a torn esophagus, internal bleeding, emergency surgery, flashed through his mind with horrifying clarity. His multi-billion-dollar empire, his meticulously planned future, all of it could have been jeopardized by a single, careless bite. He slowly, deliberately, placed the pastry back on the vendor's cart, his movements stiff and robotic. He looked at the woman, whose tired eyes were now wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. She hadn't seen their exchange, only that the wealthy man who had just bought her most expensive pastry was now looking at it with a look of profound disgust. Then he turned his full attention back to the boy. The child was still standing there, his small shoulders slumped with a release of tension, as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. The initial annoyance Alistair had felt was gone, replaced by a bewildering cocktail of emotions: shock, gratitude, and an unnerving, profound sense of curiosity. Who was this boy? How could he possibly have known? It couldn't have been a lucky guess. The certainty in his voice, the sheer terror in his eyes, it all pointed to something more. "You," Alistair said, his voice no longer cold and dismissive, but strained, uncertain. "How did you know?" The boy flinched at being addressed directly, his gaze darting to the pavement as if he was afraid to meet Alistair's eyes. I saw it," he mumbled, his voice barely audible above the city's relentless hum. "I saw her. The woman who was here before." Alistair frowned. What woman? He had been so focused on his own internal monologue, on his brief, nostalgic whim, that he had paid little attention to his surroundings. "There was a woman?" the boy insisted, his voice gaining a little more strength. "She was angry. She was arguing with the lady who runs the cart. Something about money. I heard her say she'd make her pay." The boy's words hung in the air, heavy with a chilling implication. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, malicious, an act of petty, vicious revenge that had almost claimed him as a random, collateral victim. Alistair felt a wave of nausea. The city he had viewed from his penthouse as a beautiful, abstract tapestry was, at its heart, a place of raw, untamed emotions, of desperate people capable of desperate acts. He had been so insulated from it all that he had forgotten the dangers that lurked beneath the glittering surface. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him for the first time. He saw past the dirt and the ragged clothes. He saw a child who was more observant, more attuned to the subtle currents of the world around him than he, with all his power and intelligence, had ever been. This boy lived in a world where survival depended on noticing the things that people like Alistair Finch were trained to ignore. "What's your name?" Alistair asked, the question feeling strangely intimate in the impersonal chaos of the street. The boy hesitated for a moment, as if his name was a precious commodity he was reluctant to part with. "Leo," he said finally, his voice small but clear. "My name is Leo." Alistair nodded slowly. "Leo," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "I owe you more than you know." He reached for his wallet, his hand moving automatically to the familiar comfort of a financial transaction. But for the first time in a very long time, he knew that money was not going to be enough. Alistair looked at the crisp $100 bill in his hand, and for the first time, it felt inadequate, almost insulting. A simple transaction, a reward for a service rendered, that was how his world operated. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a life, his life, handed back to him by a child who possessed nothing. Handing him money and walking away felt like a dismissal, a way of erasing the debt, of restoring the comfortable distance between their two worlds. But the chasm had already been bridged. He couldn't unsee the shard of glass. He couldn't hear the desperation in Leo's voice. He looked at the boy, at the worn-out sneakers on his feet and the hollowness in his cheeks, and he saw not a problem to be solved with cash, but a human being, a child who navigated a world of dangers Alistair couldn't even imagine. $100 isn't going to fix this, Alistair said, more to himself than to Leo. He tucked the bill back into his wallet. You need to eat. Not just today. Let me buy you a proper meal, a real one. At a restaurant. Leo's eyes widened, a flicker of suspicion warring with a dawning hope. People like Alistair didn't talk to people like him, let alone invite them to a restaurant. It was a violation of the city's unspoken rules. I can't, Leo stammered, taking a step back. I can't go in there. He gestured vaguely at the gleaming facades of the buildings around them, temples of commerce and fine dining where he was invisible, or worse, an unwelcome sight. Alistair understood. The boy's ragged clothes, his unwashed face, they were a uniform of exclusion. Yes, you can, Alistair said, a new and unfamiliar resolve hardening his voice. You're with me. He led Leo away from the food cart, away from the scene of his near disaster, and into a quiet, elegant bistro he knew from his previous life, a place of soft lighting, starched white tablecloths, and the gentle clinking of silverware. The hostess, a woman with a perfectly coiffed chignon and a practiced, insincere smile, took one look at Leo and her smile faltered. Her eyes flickered to Alistair, a silent question in her gaze. Alistair met her look with a cold, unwavering stare that left no room for argument. A table for two, he said, his voice calm but absolute. They were seated at a quiet table in the corner, the soft leather of the booth a stark contrast to the hard pavement Leo called home. The boy sat stiffly, his hands tucked under his legs, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected to be thrown out at any moment. Alistair ordered for both of them, choosing simple, hearty dishes that he hoped would be comforting rather than intimidating. As they waited for their food, a silence settled between them, not awkward, but filled with unspoken questions. You said you saw the woman, Alistair began gently, not wanting to frighten the boy. The one who argued with the vendor. Why her? Why did you know it was her? Leo fidgeted with a loose thread on his sleeve. He kept his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, his voice a low murmur. Because of my mom, he said, the words catching in his throat. My mom, she used to work in a kitchen. A big one at a fancy hotel. She was a pastry chef. She taught me things. About food, about people. He finally looked up, and Alistair was struck by the profound sadness in his young eyes, a sadness that seemed too vast for his small frame to contain. She taught me to watch people's hands. Leo continued. She said you can tell everything about a person by their hands. If they're careful. If they're angry. The woman at the cart, her hands were angry. She was squeezing a piece of broken bottle in her pocket. I saw it. Just a little glint. When she walked away, she pretended to stumble. And her hand, it went right over the pastry. The story tumbled out of him, a torrent of grief and memory. He told Alistair about his mother, about her passion for her craft, about the intricate sugar sculptures she would make, and about the pride she took in her work. He spoke of a time when their life was not on the streets, a time of warmth and safety and the sweet smell of baking. And then he told him how it had all fallen apart. His mother had gotten sick, a rare, aggressive form of arthritis that had crippled her hands, the very tools of her trade. She lost her job. The medical bills piled up, an insurmountable mountain of debt. They lost their apartment. And then, a few months ago, on a cold, rain-swept night in a homeless shelter, he had lost his mother. Leo's voice cracked, and he fell silent, his small body racked with a grief that was still raw, still gaping. Alistair sat there, the sounds of the bustling restaurant fading into a distant hum. The billionaire, the master of the universe, felt a profound and humbling sense of his own ignorance. He had built an empire, but he knew nothing of real loss, of real courage. He had been so consumed by the acquisition of things that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. Leo's story wasn't just about a near miss with a piece of glass. It was about a love that transcended death, a mother's lesson that had reached out from beyond the grave to save a stranger's life. The food arrived, steaming and fragrant, but for a long moment, neither of them moved. The story of Leo's mother hung in the air between them, a sacred, tragic testament. Alistair looked at the boy across the table, who was trying so hard to be brave, to hold back the tears that shimmered in his eyes, and he felt a powerful, protective instinct rise within him, an emotion he hadn't felt for anyone in decades. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, built brick by brick with every ruthless deal and every sacrificed relationship, began to crumble. He had entered this bistro as a man buying a meal for a boy he pitied, a debt to be paid. He now saw that it was he who was in debt, a debt that could never be repaid with money or a single act of charity. Leo had not just saved his physical life, he had, in the span of an afternoon, shown him the utter bankruptcy of his own. He had been living in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth, but starved of genuine human connection. He had mistaken power for strength and solitude for freedom. Leo, who had nothing, possessed a wisdom and a resilience that Alistair, with all his billions, could only marvel at. The boy's knowledge, born from love and loss, was a currency far more valuable than anything traded on the stock exchange. It was the currency of the human heart. Leo, Alistair said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Your mother. She sounds like she was an incredible woman. Leo nodded, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. She was, he whispered. She was the best. Alistair pushed a plate of warm bread towards the boy. Eat, he urged gently. You need your strength. Tentatively, Leo picked up a piece of bread, his movements still hesitant, but the sharp edge of his fear had softened. As he ate, color began to return to his face. For the first time, Alistair saw him not as a symbol of poverty, but simply as a boy, a hungry child who deserved so much more than the world had given him. The meal became a quiet turning point. The city outside, with its frantic pace and its cold indifference, ceased to exist. In the warm glow of the bistro, an unlikely bond was forged between the billionaire who had everything and the boy who had nothing. Alistair didn't just see a problem to be solved. He saw a future. He saw a bright, observant child with a brilliant mind and a compassionate heart, a boy who deserved a chance, a real chance to escape the brutal lottery of his birth. As they finished their meal, Alistair knew what he had to do. This couldn't be a one-time gesture. It had to be the beginning of something new, for both of them. He couldn't go back to his sterile penthouse, to his empty life, pretending this had never happened. Leo had opened a door in his soul, and Alistair had no desire to close it. He paid the bill, leaving a tip so large it made the waitress's eyes water, and they stepped back out into the fading afternoon light. The city looked different to Alistair now. It was no longer an abstract map of assets and liabilities, but a place filled with stories, with hidden tragedies and unexpected heroes. He looked down at Leo, who was staring up at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The boy's future was a blank page, and for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Finch wanted to be the one to help write what came next. It was no longer about charity. It was about connection. It was about honoring the memory of a woman he had never met, pastry chef whose love for her son had reached across the veil of death to teach a billionaire the meaning of life. This was not the end of a strange encounter. It was the beginning of a shared journey. For Alistair, it was a chance at redemption. For Leo, it was a chance at a life he had never dared to dream of, a life where he would never be hungry or afraid again, a life where his mother's legacy of love and watchfulness would not only be remembered, but celebrated. The homeless boy had shouted a warning, and the billionaire had frozen. But in that frozen moment, something had thawed within him, and as they walked away from the bistro and towards an unknown future, Alistair Finch knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he was the one who had truly been saved. The transformation in Alistair Finch was not instantaneous, but it was profound and irreversible. He didn't just write a check and hand Leo over to a faceless bureaucracy. He became an active, present force in the boy's life. His first act was to secure a safe and comfortable place for Leo to live. He purchased a small, sunlit apartment in a quiet, respectable neighborhood not far from a good school. He hired a kindly woman, a retired teacher named Mrs. Gable, to act as Leo's guardian and tutor, to help him bridge the gaps in his education and to provide the stable, nurturing presence he so desperately needed. He took Leo shopping, not for the designer clothes he himself favored, but for comfortable, practical things, sturdy shoes, warm jackets, jeans, and a mountain of books. He watched, his heart aching, as Leo ran his hands over the new clothes, his eyes wide with a disbelief that slowly, day by day, began to morph into a tentative sense of security. Alistair found that he was canceling meetings, delegating tasks he once would have insisted on controlling himself, all to make time for Leo. He helped him with his homework, took him to baseball games, and taught him how to ride a bike in the park. In turn, Leo taught Alistair how to see the world again. He pointed out the intricate patterns of a spider's web, the different species of birds that gathered on the telephone wires, the way the light hit the tops of the buildings at sunset. He reintroduced Alistair to the simple, forgotten joys of a world that existed outside of a balance sheet. One day, Alistair took Leo to the site of a new building his company was constructing, a gleaming skyscraper that would soon pierce the clouds. He had intended it to be his magnum opus, a monument to his own success. But standing there, with Leo by his side, he saw it differently. He saw an opportunity. He announced the creation of the Leo Finch Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing housing, education, and culinary arts training for homeless youth. He named the foundation's first project, the Madeleine, after Leo's mother. It was to be a state of the art culinary school, housed in the first 5 floors of his new skyscraper. That would provide free training and job placement for at-risk young people who shared his mother's passion. The news sent shockwaves through the business world. Alistair Finch, the ruthless corporate raider, had become a philanthropist. Some called it a PR stunt. Others whispered that he'd lost his mind. But those who saw him with Leo, who witnessed the genuine affection and pride in his eyes, knew that it was something far more real. Alistair had found a purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth. He had found a family. He had found a son. The story of the homeless boy and the billionaire became a quiet legend in the city, a tale whispered not in boardrooms, but in shelters and community centers, a story of hope and redemption. It was a reminder that the most valuable things in life are not the things we own, but the connections we forge, and that sometimes the greatest truths are revealed in the most unexpected of places. We hope this story from Lived Truths has moved you. It's a testament to the fact that a single moment of attention, of listening to a voice that society often ignores, can change the course of a life, or in this case, 2 lives. We believe that everyone has a story worth hearing, and that by sharing these tales of compassion and unexpected connection, we can all learn to see the world and each other a little differently. If you want to be a part of a community that celebrates the profound and often unseen truths of the human experience, then please take a moment to subscribe to our channel Lived Truths. Click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world.